Today, I wanted to show one of my own games that I played 2 weeks ago in an open here in Canada.
Hmm.
There were a few interesting aspects to this game. First of all, it was a game against a really strong player. It was against an IM, and I would say it was a pretty instructive and good quality game. And second interesting aspect was that I almost forfeited this game. It
How
was
did that happen?
It was a morning round, and on the way there, I realized that all of the roads in downtown Ottawa were closed because of a race or marathon that was taking place, and I couldn't get on the other side of the bridge where
Oh
the
no.
tournament was held. So I was more than 30 minutes late and
Oh
should have been
gosh.
forfeited the game, but I was lucky that my opponent was also a few minutes late at the start. So
Oh
because of
my
that little
gosh.
buffer time, I still had time when I got there. I started the game 30 minutes late, with 30-minute odds against an IM, but that gave me, a lot of adrenaline and to play quickly and to make it a good game after all.
And as we all know, adrenaline, that's the thing to make you play better in chess. And you were even black. I mean,
Yeah.
wow. Okay, so yeah, very, very curious what you made of this game and
Yeah, so
about
the
your
game
opening
started with
choice.
d4,
Hmm.
d5, decided to play something solid with e6 here. Now he goes knight to f3, and I play this h6 line. I don't know if you remember it. It's essentially stopping this bishop g5 idea.
Yeah.
It's very common. We've seen these structures a lot. For example, in knight c3, knight f6, takes bishop g5. This is a very popular setup for white, and it leads to these structures. But h6 might not be, the best. It might not be the most common move, but it stops that idea that white always goes for, and I think it gives white some things to solve here of where to put the bishop.
Interesting. Yes, and I think I remember this, and I think I appreciated this because, yeah, it also gets you a little bit out of the opening you normally play because it is so uncommon, but it is still like, yeah, as you said, not the best move, but
Yeah,
it's
there's
working.
nothing
It's working.
there's nothing positionally wrong with
Yeah.
it. So I would say it's a pretty, safe
Hmm.
sideline, if we can call it like that. So it's exactly the same ideas, but you just included this move with
Yeah.
it. My opponent goes more for a Catalan setup with g3 and bishop to g2, and I also continue regular development on my end with bishop out, castling, and b6. So
Hmm.
now that this bishop is closed on this diagonal, we will have to fianchetto it at some point. And here white needs to decide what to do with this dark squared bishop now. It cannot reach g5. It doesn't really want to go to f4 and double the pawns. The other two places feel counterintuitive, so white has to go for something like b3 um, to activate it onto b2. Now I go for the most typical breakthrough plan, which is c5 in these positions. Now there's a lot of tension in the center, and it can get resolved in a lot of ways because both colors want to capture at some point one of
Hmm.
these two pawns. My opponent does it first. Usually white gets the first choice to do that. So he captures here. I like to capture with the pawn to keep more control of the center and keep the pawns more connected. Now, I play this really funny looking move because we are taught to not put the knight on the edge of the board, but I thought knight to a6 was logical because it was defending on c5.
Yes.
Otherwise, on c6, there's nothing wrong with this one either, but there's a little bit less protection of both this pawn and this pawn because it's covering the bishop. So I thought the knight on a6 served similar ideas with knight before, but at least defended this pawn and kept this pawn protected. So um, now we get to here. Do you remember what the structure is? Because we've looked at it briefly before in one of the previous lessons.
It's a hanging pawn structure.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
if you don't know it yet, if you're, this is the first time you're watching this, hey, thanks. Cool. And check out the hanging pawn episode, which we made, I don't know how many episodes ago. We've made a lot of episodes. So check it out. It's very interesting, very informative.
Yeah, so we get exactly this pawn structure, and it happens in many different openings, and this is one of them. So now, of course, black has the center, but these pawns can become weak. And if you lose one of them, then you pretty much are going to lose the second one. So
Mhm.
you need to really put all of the energy into protecting these pawns and into maintaining that center.
I have
And
no
white
doubt
has
you
to put,
managed because you had so much adrenaline still.
yeah, because I was down 30 minutes and I had to play quickly. So sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. Um, Now my opponent does what is right in this position. He puts more pressure onto the d5 pawn and also potentially wants to jump to f5 with the knight.
And look how nice, he also has a knight on the rim after all. So
Yeah, he returned the favor of that. Now the rook goes to e8, just on
mhm.
a good place for the rook. And now rook a to d1. This might be the first important decision, I would say. How do you think we should deal with having this pawn attacked, the one on d5?
Yeah, that is quite interesting. It's an immediate threat because there's three pieces attacking the pawn. Question mark. There's a little bit of
Yeah.
a discovery. Well, pushing forward is of course not an option. Otherwise, we would lose our bishop on b7. So we have a couple of more options to protect it. Also, actually, there's no threat because the move knight to b4. No, it's unclear. Actually, the queen can just go to d2. I think that was a bit of a provocation. I think the knight can just go to. My idea is knight c7. End of story. Nothing too fancy.
Yeah, so you're right about both of these. So the knight could go to b4, but like in the future. If we go right away, though, I would say that's not the best because then queen moves away and the knight will get kicked out with
Yeah.
a3 on the next turn. So that's not really a permanent defense. The one with knight to c7 was my first consideration, and I was planning on it initially, but it runs into some complications after knight to f5, and then it's possible for white to take on d5 and play e4.
Eh.
So it was very complicated after some knight b4. There's some
Oh
knight h6, for
gosh.
example, too, with the idea that if I take, there's queen to c3. Um, it was just very complicated. There were a lot of things to calculate, especially these knight to d5 ideas. I wasn't really always liking them. And also some knight to a4 ideas, attacking that pawn. And then my knight doesn't know where to go. Maybe it just has to go back or it has to go to e6 and weaken that again. I'm not sure, but this move is not the best way to defend it because of that. It gives white some chances for knight to d5.
Damn. So how to deal with this then?
So
So in
in
this
the
case,
game,
yeah.
I play bishop to
Hmm.
e5. And although that doesn't completely save against this knight d5 idea, it makes it slightly better. So it was interesting to calculate this knight d5 that existed in the position. It does, and it leads to sort of an equal position, which I think my opponent didn't want either. So now white has to take right here and then play e4 to regain that piece. But the thing is, so the thing is they had to take here so that my knight now cannot move to b4 and counterattack because now rook takes d8 is with check. So I just get the pawn back on d5, and I wouldn't say that white achieved something huge with this trade. They just traded my knight for their piece,
Hmm.
and all the pawns will remain even. So it doesn't look the most convincing after this bishop to e5.
Hmm.
So my opponent plays rook to e1, maybe preparing these knight d5 and e4 ideas. Of course, you mentioned this d4 plan, which is right, and usually you do, if you have a chance to advance your pawns, it's usually good. Or if you have a chance to have them be less of a weakness, d4 would achieve that. So I do want to get d4 to happen. So that's why rook to b8 was played to protect that bishop,
Aha.
so that the rook can maybe take back and then can even join on d7, which would be a good place.
Hmm.
Now this knight d5 is not going to work anymore. It's not going to work as nearly as well. So white plays e3. And now we get close to the critical moment in the game. I go knight to b4 because of a certain sequence. So knight to b4, I start with it, even though it's not a permanent place for the knight, but it attacks the queen and the queen has to choose. Now the queen shouldn't really go to f5 because of knight to a2 threats.
Knight to a2.
Takes. Well, takes and take the bishop.
I see.
So the queen has to go back to b1.
Yeah, I thought it was bishop c8 actually. Was an
Oh,
option.
maybe there's some bishop c8 too, actually. But I think knight to a2 just gets a pawn for now.
Yeah.
So I would say that this for me was the critical moment of the game, because, you know, all of the pieces are developed and you really need to. That's usually the hardest moment when you have to decide what to do. We are both under 10 minutes now on the clock, so it was already getting tense in that way too. So what would you play now for black?
Okay, for you at home, stop the clock. You have 10 minutes, basically, right? We can make an
Well, you
absolute
kind of want to leave
original.
time for the end game too.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, you have just a couple of minutes. The earlier
Yeah,
you find
thanks.
this move, the better it is. Well, on my wish list is definitely to play d4, but it requires a little bit of calculation. Boop, boop, dum, doing, clonk. Well, there's a lot of swapping and swapping, and I guess it's very drawish after that. Is there anything better, though?
Well, let's touch on the d4 move then. It wasn't working. It's the absolute main idea in the position. It's, of course, something that black wants to do, especially now that all of the pieces are also getting attacked by it. But it wasn't working out at the moment. I really wanted to make it work. I kept calculating it as well. So I assume you calculated taking? Or is that what the sound, the calculation sounds were?
The calculation sound stopped at d4. No,
Okay.
I was calculating. Yeah, it's like
White could
lots of
take as
swapping.
well. But this is better because, so the reason why I didn't go for this d4 is because of now knight to a4. And there's a problem with this pawn. There's a problem with this pawn that it's pinned and it can't go anywhere. And I just actually didn't see a good way of defending this on c5 and on d4 at the same time. So if you go for something like rook here, white can even think about this. And I think that just looks kind of advantageous for white, the way that this opens up and that white will get to keep some pawns, actually, if they win the piece back.
Unpleasant.
Yeah, so is there any other ideas than d4?
Yeah, actually, I didn't think about it at all. But I wonder how good c4 is, because there is the rook on b8, there is the queen on b1. Why could this not be interesting also to get the knight to d3? I like c4 a lot, actually. But,
Okay.
But of course, our queen is hanging and it's stupid what I just thought.
Well, I actually didn't even consider c4. I think it shouldn't be too bad. But yeah, maybe we take and then
we have to get the
yeah,
queen
we can
somewhere.
take back. And right now, like there is no threat on that queen. Like there could be potentially, but if there isn't anything in the next, 1 to 2 moves, that makes it risky, I think, to give up a pawn.
Yeah, probably. Okay, so one last option maybe. Tricky. I am not convinced by any of my ideas, sadly. Dang.
So if we want to play d4, what are some things that are preventing us from doing it?
There's too many pieces in this direction on d4.
I thought that the main thing preventing us was the queen. It was the fact that we get under all of these pins, and that just makes things unpleasant, and we might even lose that pawn on d4 if our queen is still on d8.
You are so right. So the queen has to move somewhere. Well, shall we just go to a5 maybe?
Exactly. That's what I played in the game, and I think it's one of the best moves. There are other options, like you could also go for bishop to a6 and then put that knight on d3 and
Well,
regain some material with rook b3. So that was also an option, if anybody named that one. But queen to a5, I think, makes sense in combination with all the other ideas that we've had throughout the game.
mhm.
So queen to a5, we get away from this d file and threaten to play d4 at a good moment. And the thing is, if white ever decides to take us, well, right now it says really red. Oh yeah, because our knight is still there. I was like, why is it so red? But because the knight is still there.
Still enough
So
protectors, yeah.
yeah. So that's why white goes a3 first to kick it out. I play to a6. And now this rook can also come in handy and pick up the b3 pawn if white ever wants to pick up the d5 pawn. And I don't think that's a bad trade for black at
Not at
all.
all. And this is once again this thing. I mean, it's not even a tactic what we're looking at, but when you're solving a tactic or when you try to solve a tactic, you find hints and clues. And there is this B file, which is, yeah, there is some strength in it. So with a little bit more calculation, I might have been able to, yeah, consider this as well.
Yeah, and
That's
it's not
interesting.
exactly tactics, right? It's
Yeah.
just sort of calculation, but you need it in the game to actually be able to make some courageous moves. If you calculate it and you see that it works, it kind of it helps. It
Hmm.
helps a lot to do these mini calculations during the game too. So now white defends this pawn with queen to c2. So far, I think it's been nobody has made any mistakes. Now I play finally d4, what I wanted to play for so long, and now it seemed to be finally working, and my pawns weren't hanging
Hmm.
as much as before. So my opponent plays knight to a4, so putting pressure on both of these two pawns. And this is another moment where I would want you to try to find the best move.
Okay, and also for you at home, please feel
There's a few good moves, but
encouraged.
I really like the one that I played.
Huh. Is that so? Yeah. So, well,
I'm
I
biased
have
towards.
I have to calculate what happens after. Just want to do this tactic. So
Yeah.
takes e3, takes e5, takes um, f2 check.
Yeah, are you sure white will take on e5 though?
Probably not, right?
Yeah, well, actually, why would you take on f2? Because
Yeah,
now
yeah,
you're
yeah.
opening up the
It's
defense.
just yeah. Apologies. That was stupid. So
So yeah,
mm,
no, actually, yeah, you can't take like that. So yeah, you would probably take here.
yeah. Well, then I wouldn't take that. I guess I just wanted to see if that works.
No, this one is an option. Taking on e3 is
Mm,
one of the options. And I don't really know how white is going to trade, but for example, like this,
yeah, but I haven't
it,
accomplished
it's
anything.
equal. It's equal. So this one is all good. It's one of the options. Um, so d takes e3 is a pretty good move,
Yeah.
regardless.
Also, our bishop was hanging on b7, so I'm not so 100%
No, but
sure.
we took the one on b2, so
Ah,
they
yeah.
had to
Okay.
take back. That's why.
Ah. Mm, that doesn't work. Oh, I'm rusty. Not looking good for the Beal tournament. Haven't played chess in weeks. So
But you have so many trainings
I
with
wish
Elizabeth.
I wish that would help. But I'm not like basically moving the moves myself and thinking for myself only for those little split situations. It's for you at
Mhm.
home. This is a really good and effective training, and I heard some very nice things about this. But yeah, for me, it depends. I'm learning stuff, but not as I would hope.
But yeah, of course, when you try to play in an actual game and apply that, that's when you learn like
Yeah.
even more, for sure. So
Okay,
I
so
I thought you would see.
here's my final move.
Yeah.
It's going to be rook e to c8.
No, that's not what I wanted you to say. Rook e to c8, probably not bad. I don't think it blunders anything. It might though. Actually, it might blunder something
Oh no.
like that.
Oh no.
And there's issues with the c8 rook. It's okay. I really
Oh
thought that
boy.
after you said d takes e3, your next option, I don't know if anybody at home found that, the next option to look at is d3.
I looked at that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, but I couldn't find anything
So,
which.
yeah, one of the things here is that this rook
Oh.
is now under the attack of the queen. So the rook cannot take that pawn.
Oh.
So
That
that's
is
one of
of
the
course.
details.
Yeah.
The queen can, and that's exactly what happened in the game. And now
Oh.
I wanted to make both captures, both this bishop on b2 capture and the bishop on g2 capture.
Yeah.
And I should have chosen the one on g2 first. But I just kind of thought, like I knew it made a difference, but I thought that the one on b2 was better, but turns out it wasn't. So if you take here first, um, this move order is the best, but bishop to e5 has to also be considered here. So we kind of get into a weird position with opposite colored bishops. It just felt a bit of a weird position to me, even though black is totally fine.
Mm-hmm.
But it just felt a bit weird to let this bishop run free like that. So I first took here. Now my opponent takes here first. Rook takes, knight takes, and now queen to a3. And you'll see why it did make a difference to have that rook on b8 versus on b7. It does make a difference. So white had a really, really nice maneuver here. This is something that I had to calculate during the game, and it was really complicated. But there was this maneuver knight to c4, which, I had to
Okay.
see it all the way when I was playing d3 because all of these things were forced. And I thought that everything was fine here after queen takes b3, knight to d6. So of course, see now we really wish that rook wasn't standing there, and it would have made a big difference if it's on b8. Everything is fine after knight to d6 because of takes, and rook to d8.
Yeah.
And we save our rook, and it's a great endgame with being up a pawn for black.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a really sneaky idea, and neither of us saw it during the game. I think it's a really sort of not really a computer move, but once you see it, it makes sense, but you don't look at it initially. So because of that queen trade idea, the best move for white is queen to e2. It's really, really strong and gives white a good advantage. It's completely illogical, but the whole point is that you keep an eye on the a6 knight, and by avoiding the queen trade, you get both knight to d6 and knight to a5 ideas. And that's just not good for black.
You cannot stop this.
Yeah, you have to go something away with the rook, and then I guess give up either the knight on a6 or the rook on e8.
What?
You get okay, it's not lost yet because you have a pawn for, pawn and knight for the rook.
Sure.
But queen e2, I mean, neither of us saw it, but once you look at these ideas, you start understanding why queen to e2 is the best move.
That is crazy, yeah.
Yeah.
So simple, but so, yeah, forcing.
Yeah, it's so simple, but nobody would look at that move, right?
True. Absolutely. Yeah. That's just completely off the mind.
Yeah, so maybe for this reason that he didn't see this and didn't want to go for that queen trade, he goes knight to a4. So I was a bit surprised that there was no knight to c4 because I thought that was the main move. But he plays knight to a4, I guess just wants to attack the knight on a6, so that's why it goes away. Now we get, I get this pawn on b3, which was weak for a while, and instead of that, my opponent gets the pawn on c5. So we went into this endgame. Which side do you like it for?
Well,
white or black?
I guess black has this titsy tiny chance more because there's one pawn on a5, but then there's too many pieces on the board, so I'm afraid it just won't make the difference. So if black manages to swap off enough pieces, but even that, it could be a draw.
Yeah, so in most of these cases, it's going to end in a draw. You're right about that evaluation. I thought I was pretty safe as black here until I accidentally lost a pawn in the next few moves under time pressure.
Oh
So
no.
I played rook e to b8. Um, and the grandmaster that was watching the game after told me that, how do you not play rook a8? Why would you put your rooks like that? Put the rook behind the pawn, follow the chess principles.
I've heard about this rule once. Yeah.
So, but I played rook here because I wanted them to be on an open file, on the
Uh-huh.
b file. Um, but this turns out that my rooks actually run into trouble. So he goes knight to d4, and now a bunch of rook moves will run into the
Poop.
court of the knight.
Oh.
So I go rook, yeah, and all of these squares are taken with that knight on the edge of the board somehow is actually giving really a lot of trouble.
Yeah,
So other
he
than that,
became so strong.
there's no other moves with the rook, only rook to b7. And after knight c5, my rook once again has nowhere to go. If it goes over here to defend the pawn, then there's knight to c6.
Oh
Eh,
no.
And it's just a sad moment that we have to give up this rook. But this pawn. But I played rook to b2, so I decided to stay active on the second rank.
Sad moment. I just heard the violin, the sad violin in the background.
Yeah. But there was no time to be sad. We had both had like 30 seconds, so
Oh gosh, yeah.
we just had to make the moves. And still, I think it's not the worst position to defend. It's only a pawn, and usually the way to defend these positions, you'll see basically what I did in the game. But I think here is probably the last important decision of whether to trade the rook or to not trade the rook.
Hmm.
And I chose to trade it because I just get my second rook in also by attacking that knight. And I don't know, do you ever have trouble holding such endgames, or are you pretty good at it?
The answer is I am horrible at it. And but I'm always saying that, and then I'm having those end games, and somehow I manage to get through with it. So I don't know, hard to tell.
Yeah.
I personally maybe I just dislike them or dislike to play them. That's
Yeah,
probably
it
it.
always depends on the position, right? But I think it's always unpleasant when you're down, let's say down a pawn. So you can't really offer a draw. You can't, the opponent is going to try,
Yeah.
and then you have to also defend it in time trouble, and then eventually it gets worse, 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 and then you make a mistake, and then suddenly it's much worse than it was before. So
Yes.
that happens all the time. It happens to top grandmasters as well, happen when they play against Magnus.
Especially
But
then, just very
especially when
recently
that
again. Yeah.
happens. I think the absolute key to such positions is to stay active. And for me, that was the biggest takeaway from this game. Because imagine my rook wasn't on b2 and I wasn't doing anything good, I wasn't doing anything active, then white would improve, slowly bring these pawns forward, slowly bring the king, start making threats on my f7 pawn, making threats on my king, and eventually your margin for error will be like smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually you'll have a situation where there's only one saving move and then you don't find it.
Hmm.
So I think the key is to stay active because you want to keep making threats for the opponent so that they cannot just comfortably improve, improve, improve without any risks for themselves. So the way
And
that I made this
yeah,
draw was
knights
by
are
playing
so good.
really quickly, really like principled. So I decided to go after this f2 pawn
Hmm.
and make problems there. Playing knight g4 immediately wasn't working because of knight to d3, and that would attack this knight, and I guess it would lead to a trade. Kind of unpleasant as an
Yeah.
endgame. I don't think that benefits black at all to go into this down a pawn. So instead, this knight goes to an interesting place of d1, but it does its job well there. And after rook to d2, my opponent made a check and went back. And I decided to go fully against this f2
Yes.
pawn, and white doesn't have anything better to do than to repeat the position or give up the pawn on f2. My opponent didn't want to give up the pawn on f2, so we actually just repeated with the knight moves and the rook moves. I mean, it feels like a simple draw, but I think there was a lot to it, and it was a big takeaway for the endgame to stay active and to keep up some threats against your opponent. I hope you enjoyed the game and learned something new from it.
Absolutely. I also hope I learned something today. Very, very, very informative, very instructive. As always, thank you so much, Svitlana. Thank you, everybody, for watching. We see each other soon enough. Bye.